Okay, thank you for coming. I'm Scott Frazier. I'm the floodplain administrator for the city of Key West. In the old days, when they first came out with flood maps, and then they came out with the changes, FEMA would show up to a community, say, here are your new flood maps. You have 90 days to accept them or we're going to kick you out of the program. And somebody had to call the police because it got out of hand real quick and agitated people. Well, they've taken a completely different tact this time. Our current maps are dated in 2005, so it's been a while since an update, and FEMA's really changed their methodology about how they proceed with these changes, so it's not so traumatic. And they've been coming to me periodically a couple times a year showing me how they're reaching the conclusions that they're ultimately going to reach. And this time around, there was a little bit more information, and I thought it was a good time to let it out publicly and see where we're at. And they're going to show you where we are now and where we plan to be and when the new flood maps will get look at the real flood maps. Probably in 2019, 2020, somewhere around there, but they'll go into that timeline. We are recording this so for replay later, so I've asked the presenters to re-ask your questions if you have them into the microphone so that who's ever watching this from afar will be able to see it.
He already said what I was going to say, so I might as well sit down. Now, thanks. And as he said, what we had decided with this new coastal study, we would do interim meetings. And like you said, the way we used to do it, we'd come in and say, hey, we're going to do a new study. We would go away for 2 years, 3 years, and then drop off preliminaries and say, here, you got the 90-day appeal. But we decided we weren't going to do that with the coastal studies since it was very, very important because we hadn't done a new coastal study. I think the slide says 30 to 40 years. So just because the maps are 2005 doesn't mean we did a new coastal study. So that's what we're here today to do, that interim meeting. And as I've told everybody, several years ago when Craig Fugate was our director, he made a comment to us that said, I want you in the communities more often. And the first thing I thought, yeah, that's going to cost some money, Mr. Fugate, Director Fugate. But he was, in a sense, I don't know if he was talking about this, but I think he was right. We do need to get in more often. So that's what we're talking about doing, coming in and doing some updates, and that's what this is. We're going to do the, this update is basically a storm surge analysis update, and we'll get into it. There's several different studies and several different levels into doing these studies, and that's what we're here to talk about, is where we're at, where we're going, and what we've accomplished so far. Is this it, Mike? Okay, all I'm seeing is myself. Okay, very different. Okay. Again, want to welcome everybody. Again, this is the update on the coastal flood study. As I said, still water elevation information. We've got a timeline in here when you would see preliminary maps and when possibly they would go effective. It's in the presentation and all that. Let me do some quick introductions, and we'll just go around the room. It was really funny. I tell everybody I was in a training one time about holding meetings. One of the things they said is don't go around the room and introduce. I'm supposed to stand at the door and meet everybody as they come in and greet them and all that and figure out who you are. What do you got? 1, 2, 3 sets of door. I can't be at all of them, so that doesn't work. So I threw that out. But anyway, for those who don't know, I'm Mark Vieira, senior engineer in FEMA Region 4. In Atlanta, and the project manager on this coastal study. As I've told everybody in the past, I wasn't the technical monitor. That was somebody else. That is not with us anymore in the region, is actually at headquarters. So, but she's still involved in reviewing it. So again, I'm Mark Vieira, and let's just go around the room and we'll introduce everybody. Mike, you want to go first?
Sure. I'm Michael Delchark. I'm a coastal engineer with the Baker AECOM team, part of the team doing this study.
I'm Krista Connor, a coastal flood specialist, also one of the folks with the study team here doing the study.
Hi, I'm Terry Johnson with Affiliated Design and Construction Manager.
Steve Russ with Firm Fair Insurance Rates in Monroe.
Yeah, Simon Stafford. I sort of live right by the sea, so I'm interested.
Ray Ortiz, Monroe County.
I'm Mark Boone with Monroe County.
Lori Lear with Monroe County.
I'm Kristen Martinenza. I'm the branch chief of risk analysis in FEMA Region 4 in Atlanta.
Gary Ward, a coastal environmental engineer, currently a resident of Key West across from the lighthouse, and really my office is in Riviera Beach, Palm Beach County.
Bill Hunter, I'm a resident.
Jim Bouquet, City of Key West.
Corey Diamond, AECOM Atlanta.
Les Volmer, owner of Knowles House B&B, and our property is in a flood zone.
Allison Higgins, Sustainability Coordinator, City of Key West.
Hi, I'm Norman Fuller with Fuller's Insurance.
Heather Bennett, Florida Keys Real Estate Company.
Jerry Martin, Florida Keys Real Estate Company. Darlene Thomas, Florida Keys Real Estate Company.
Good afternoon, Chris Moonis. I'm the city administrator in Key Colony Beach.
Caroline Horn, firm, Fair Insurance Rates in Monroe.
Karen Morrell with DeWitt Insurance and also firm board member.
Hey, I'm Monica Cook. I'm an instructor at the Florida Keys Community College.
Save the best for last. Eric Isaacs, Florida Keys Land Surveying.
Give you a little update of where we're at on the mapping. Years ago, Congress basically came to FEMA and said your maps are not in that good a shape. They're pretty old, certain areas, and we basically told Congress, give us some money and we'll do some new studies. And one of the things that we decided was we really, really need to do the coastal. Not just Region 4, but the whole FEMA regions. All the regions decided it was time to update the coastal studies. In our region, we have North Carolina all the way over to Mississippi, so we're in the process of updating some of those areas. Some areas have already got updated firm maps in those areas. But in Florida, what we decided to do on the East Coast was start at the north and move south. Same thing over on in the Gulf side. Water Management District did the areas around the Panhandle, and then we picked up from there. So we're in the process of updating all our coastal studies. Same thing's going on in regions 9 and 10, which are out in the Pacific. Regions 5 and Region 2 has the Great Lakes, so they're actually updating those coastal studies where they've really never even had coastal studies before. So that's what we're in the process of doing. And just to let you know, in this meeting, we do not have the preliminary maps. We're not that far along in the study. So I just want to let you know that you're not really going to see preliminary maps. We haven't done that as part of the study yet. So yes, you may be in the special flood hazard now. You may not. Don't know because we haven't got that far along. So I just want to make sure you understand that. And I think Mike and Krista will talk about that as well. The next slide. Like we talked about in the past, we would come in, do a study, give you the firm maps, and that was it. And basically all those firm maps would show you whether you were in the special flood hazard area or not. In or out, gray or white. That's the way the maps used to be printed. But we've done a couple of things different. We're basically trying to tell everybody you're in a flood area, no matter what's shown on the maps. Either you're a high risk or medium risk or a low risk. As an engineer and been doing this for years, that's hard for me to grasp because it's always been in or out, but I'm changing with the times. So that's, basically what the maps are. But the other thing is, you really only know whether you're in the floodplain or you weren't. And one of the things we're doing as part, and that's what this little diagram is trying to show there, is what we're trying to do, what we're calling risk map. Everybody says map. Oh, all about maps. It really isn't. It's mapping, assessment, and planning. And the whole idea behind this is to show you, yes, the houses could flood, the property could flood. You know what your risk is. but what are you doing about it? And the whole idea behind this is, yes, you know you're in the floodplain, but are you mitigating? Are you doing anything? I give one example. When James Lee Witt was our director years ago, there was an elderly couple that owned a house over in Pascagoula, Mississippi, that had flooded some 30 times. After every storm, they would rebuild and continue to live there, just on and on and on. James Lee said, well, this is ridiculous. These people need to do something. They need to mitigate. They need to either move out, tear the house down, or do something. So that's what we're trying to do a little bit in what we're calling the risk map program, is we'll give you the preliminary maps like we always have, along with the flood insurance study text, but there's going to be some additional data that we will give you, the communities, to help you plan and try to mitigate, from the hazard. One of the examples that I give people is, let's say you've got 3 houses that are shown in the special flood hazard on the map. All you know is they got to get flood insurance if they got a federally backed mortgage. That's it. But you don't really know how deep that water is going to get. You can't tell. All you know is if you had an elevation certificate, you could tell. But if you don't, all you know is they're in the floodplain. But as part of these products that we will give out later, after we give you the preliminary maps and later on, will help you, because we have such good LIDAR nowadays, to know the ideal about these houses. Like if you have a house that would get during a 1% chance flood or the 100-year, 8 foot of water in it. What do you do for that person? Probably need to buy them, do a buyout or an acquisition, tear the house down and move them out of there. A house that gets 4 foot of water in it, you would be able to tell with this new product. Basically, maybe what you need to do there for them is maybe elevate. Or if a house gets 1 foot of water in it, maybe do some type of flood proofing. But the whole idea behind this risk map program is to give you some other tools and data to help you try to decide what you could do to mitigate the flood risk. And that's the whole idea behind that. Were you going to say something? Oh, I thought, okay. So anyway, so again, what we're here to do is just give you an update where we're at on the coastal study, and to basically say we're trying to do this different than we've done it in the past. Okay? And let me turn it over to Mike.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to be running through a bunch of information. Some of it's pretty technical. By all means, wave your hand, ask questions. You know, we're here to explain this stuff to you. So we want you to walk away from this meeting understanding a good bit about what's going on in this study technically, so that when the maps do come out in a year or so, you're comfortable with the results.
Grab the mic in case you need
Yeah. So, like I said, by all means, wave your hands and stop me if I'm saying something that doesn't make sense or I need to clarify something, okay? Yes? Okay, good. So the current study, as Mark pointed out, was done in the late 70s, early 80s. It was state-of-the-art at the time, but you can imagine how much has changed since then with computing power and just the data we have available. So it really was time to update the study. So FEMA is doing the Cadillac of studies here. They said, just go get the best state-of-the-art practices and models and data and everything that you can, put together the best study you can so that we get a good feel for what the storm surge is going to look like. So that's what we've done. Yes, so you can imagine the computing differences that have changed. I know a study that I did just 18 years ago, we were mapping things on quadrangle sheets, USGS quadrangle sheets, which you can imagine how poor those are. You wouldn't think of doing anything that way these days, but that's the best that we had back then. Yeah, so there's some of the details there. So when we talk about the coastal study, there's a couple things I want to point out. The first two, well, when you think of, can I borrow that? I just cannot stand still. So, can you hear me okay? So when you think of a hurricane impinging, think of Irma as she's coming on land, you have a couple different pieces in there, and that's what we want to talk about. So you have the storm surge, which is you think of the impact of the whole hurricane that's coming up along the coast. It isn't just the waves on top that are crashing, but it's the whole storm surge as the momentum of the whole system moves on shore, right? So you guys are familiar with what storm surge looks like. You know what evacuation zones are. This is not that. This is not your NOAA evacuation storms or anything like that. This is quite different, but the principle's the same, right? So it's that momentum as the storm comes on shore. So I do not have a pointer. So you see that bottom line, it says SWEL. That's still water elevation. So that's what we call when a hurricane comes in, and that's the storm surge piece of it. Still water is kind of a misnomer because it's not very still. That's what we call it. And then that little ramp piece that says setup, that for the first time, coastal engineers are actually able to compute those two pieces together. And it's pretty significant. It's pretty, I mean, coastal engineers are all geeked out about it. We have a model that can actually couple those two processes. And so when you look at the momentum as it comes up and then that final rush of the water as the whole system's coming on shore, that's the still water elevation and the setup, those two pieces. Second process, that is one whole modeling system that I'll get into, and that's what I'll talk about in depth. And then the next piece that Krista Connor's going to talk about, we'll talk about the run-up, erosion, and then those waves. So if you think about the wave, the top piece there, who lives in a V zone? Anybody? Live in an A zone? All those pieces are the top of the wave envelope. That's what's always been on your map. So when you see a VE16 or something like, that's the top of that wave envelope. And so we'll get to that and how that ends up on a map. That's the second round of modeling that we'll be doing. But for this first round of modeling with the hurricane simulations, it's those still water elevation and the setup. So items 1 and 2. And then items 3 and 4 is what we're starting now, and we'll do that for about the next year with the mapping. And as Crystal will point out in the schedule, that's when we have those results, we'll be able to put together some models. So the stuff that I'm presenting today is, as Mark said, we're trying to, FEMA, it's like a whole new era, right? They said, okay, we finished some modeling. Let's get out in the community and show them what we have. What are the results of this modeling? So you get some idea of what the changes are going to be. And I think that's just a really great place to be, right? Just, hey, here's what we're seeing so far, just so you have some heads up on what's going on. A couple other things. People ask, is it going up or is it going down? And the answer is yes. Some areas it's going up, some areas it's going down. There's not a consistent bias one way or the other. As Mark pointed out, we're doing this from North Carolina all the way down. And so we are seeing finer resolution, but you can't say it's not like FEMA's coming in and everything's going up, you know, a foot or 2 or 3 or whatever. It really varies, and it's really just due to the accuracy of the data that we have. That's the one thing. The second one is this is not, you guys know your FEMA maps, and that's one thing I like about working in this city is because you guys are familiar with it. We go to some communities, they don't even know what their map looks like, but you guys very much do. That is representing a 100-year event, right? Or what's now we call a 1% annual chance event. When you say a 100-year event, people think, well, it's not going to happen again for 100 years. I'm great. I'll build on the shore, you know, and that's not the case. So FEMA, the nomenclature has really changed to say it's a 1% annual chance event. That means it has 1% chance of happening every year. So that's a lot different than saying a 100-year event, right? So that you can bring that up at your next cocktail party. You can look like the smart person because now you know the difference. So we don't say it's not a Cat 3 event. It's not a Cat 4 event because those things can really change, right? If you had a Cat 2 storm that stayed off the coast for 3 days, you know, and pounded the coast, the still water elevation would be a lot different than a Cat 4 that ripped through so fast it didn't have time to build up the storm surge. So we're really not looking at that kind of storm. It's a 1% annual chance event. Does that make sense? Everyone tracking on that? So that's what's on your maps now. Okay, so this is the area of study. When you do a large study like this, we're talking about hurricanes, right, that are massive. I mean, you guys saw what Irma looked like on top of the state. I mean, it's a huge event, right? So we had to do these in regional pieces. So we did these 4 counties. We're looking at hurricanes that come, you know, below the Keys, up the Keys, hit West Palm, hit, you know, Georgia, whatever. We're looking at storms that run all over the place and also from west to east, which is quite different. So the process that we've gone through here is this is probably the 3rd or 4th meeting that Scott's hosted for us. And the first meeting was just to say, hey, we're kicking it off. What data do you have? We used the best available topographic data from NOAA, from the Army Corps, from everybody that we could find. We culled through all the data sets that we could, captured all that data, and started setting up our models. You know, met with Scott. We had field trips where people were going around and looking at all the data and all the structures that we think could impact what the surge looks like. So we've done all that. We set up, the last two bullets there was set up a hurricane surge model, and that's the piece that we just finished. Well, the second piece, calculated still water elevations. That's the piece we just finished and why we're here today. So phase 1 was collect the data, set it up. Phase 2, calculate the still water levels. And again, you see that last 2 bullets, run the statistics on millions of nodes, and I'll show you what that means in a minute. So we're looking at the data for this whole entire region. Then the next phase is, hey guys, how you doing? The next phases are to run the overland wave model, which then will result in the mapping, and that's what Krista Connor is going to talk about in a little bit. So these are the next steps. Now, it's taken us several years to get to this point, and that's because the surge modeling was really the more intensive part of this. The next couple phases will move along more quickly, so within a year we should have some mapping results. So there's the schedule. You have that in your handout. I'm sure people will be asking, but just so you know, see that phase 4 work maps estimated for next year is when we would start seeing work maps. And that's when people really get worked up, right? I can tell them all about the great coastal engineering we're doing and everything else, and they just kind of gloss over. But then when you start showing maps and then, hey, Joe's house is in or out, and that kind of thing, then is when the rubber really starts to hit the road. But one of the objectives with being here today is that when you walk away and you will say, gee, they really did a great study here. They're looking at everything they can, the best they possibly can, so you'll feel more comfortable with the results. I want people to know that there's a lot of engineering and thought that goes into this. It's not picking a number out of thin air, and just guessing what the surge is. This is really a detailed study. So the current study that you have is based on a model that looks something like this grid. So this is just an example. This is not in the keys. But this is just an example. Each one of those squares is where they would calculate the hydrodynamics, as we say, how much water is moving around, how fast and how high it gets. It was based on a model called TT Surge. It used about a half nautical mile grid, and a lot of it used USGS quadrangles, which I'm sure our surveyor, you probably haven't looked at one of those in a while, right? There's much better data sets. But that's what it was based on back in the day. And so now what we're using is, Mark mentioned, is called LiDAR data. That's a topographic data set. Planes fly over. Anyone familiar with LiDAR data? So the planes fly over and shoot lasers down on the ground, and they get a return elevation. And so we get very detailed elevation data for all the land surface. Now, the bathymetric data is harder to get, right? So you have NOAA charts, you have fishing charts, Army Corps charts, and all that. And this is kind of showing some examples of that. You see on the left there all the swaths of data that we have. And we have pretty sophisticated data sets that prioritize based on date what bathymetric data is good, And so you still have areas where there's nothing but an old NOAA data sheet, it's the only place you have data. But so anyway, we combine all that and we put together what we call a digital elevation model, but it's really state-of-the-art, best available data that we could get everywhere. And that's the beginning of the basis of our model, of our hydrodynamic model. And everybody asked, did you include the coral reefs? Did you include the canals and channels? Did you include, Smathers Beach? Everything, yes. We included as much of that data as we possibly could is included in our model. Okay, any questions? Good. Okay, so we took that, and this took a long time. The reason I'm dwelling on it, and it's one of these minutia things that it just doesn't sound it's not great to talk about, but it is the backbone of the data, really. So it took us a long time to pull all this together, and it's really an incredible data set. And we will be sharing it with the community. Once the maps go effective, FEMA makes all this data available, and I can imagine that fishermen and everybody else would really like to have this data. Okay, so now the model mesh. If you can tell, this is the whole Atlantic Basin, Gulf of Mexico, Caribbean Basin, and everything. And this is really where our model starts to take shape. This is the digital elevation model that we've set up. This is the old model, as I mentioned, and this is the new model and what it looks like. And I know it's hard to see in this scale, but if you look on your little handouts there, that may not be much better. But you can see these little dots. You know what? I'm supposed to be able to draw on this. Let's see. No, you can't see them. Can you see the little dots on there in these little triangles? each one of those dots is a point where we're doing a numerical calculation to understand the hydrodynamics and the waves so that we get what the water surface elevation would be during a hurricane event. So you can imagine the difference in resolution between what's on the left and what's on the right, the level of detail that we went into. We've captured this is of course not Monroe County, but we've captured the dune features, we captured inlets, any channels and things that go back in. We represent all those by an elevation and by a land use. So whether it's a seagrass, a coral head, or land, somebody's building a house, a waterfront structure, whatever it is, we've included all that in the model. So just amazing level of difference in the detail.
So for those that it's hard to see, for example, on the left, there's maybe half a square, and that makes it really hard to calculate how much water is going through the inlet. You don't even have one. You have one calculation to try to estimate that entire inlet and what it's doing. On our new model, which you can't see the dots, there's about 6 or 7 dots across the mouth of that inlet. That means we're much more able to capture what is the shape of that inlet and how much water can get through there in a much more accurate way.
Right. In fact, so on this next slide, I'll show you a little idea of what it looks like. On the bottom right, if you were to space out, I call them nodes. Think of a fishing net. If you were to lay a fishing net down, each one of those knots is where you're doing a calculation, right? So the knot is the node. That's what I call it, is a node. Each one of those nodes is where we're doing those calculations. So you see on the bottom right, if the spacing were to be about 150 meters, you wouldn't be able to capture that channel as it comes through, right? It would just kind of stop there. Scott, how did you get that going? Oh, there it is, I think. There you go. Okay. So if you see this area right here, this would be what would happen if you had 150 meter spacing. But we want to show like this, we want to show this channel going all the way through. So you see this really tight resolution in here. And this is what we need, that kind of connection, and we need that very fine resolution in our model mesh in order to capture the hydrodynamics correctly. So we took this thing down. There are some places where it's down to 60, 70 feet wide spacing, And not only that, but we captured all the channels and canals. So we had engineers that are currently cross-eyed because they've been looking at this mesh for years, seriously. And they went through and made sure we captured each of the canals, each of the channels as we went through so that we're capturing the hydrodynamics correctly. So that, again, when I said this is the Cadillac of studies, this is the Cadillac of studies. We're running this thing on a supercomputer out of Mississippi. It's, this is there's over 2 million nodes in this model. And when we run a hurricane, that's like a 5-day simulation. You can imagine we're doing the calculation at each one of those points, for 2 million nodes across the whole basin. It takes quite a bit of effort. So yeah, this is just showing, if you could all walk up here and look at it, you could see the fine resolution that we have. Each of the channels and canals and everything are captured in our mesh. And the same with Key West. So you see the high areas in red, the low areas in blue, and again, just really fine detail in that model. So I show you this to say that in the end, when you get your model results, you can say, oh, they modeled everything, every hurricane that came through this whole area with great resolution and great detail. Any other questions? Yes.
Mesh is like a net. Mesh.
Yes. That's just a term. Yeah, I'm sorry. That's right.
SWAN is an acronym.
Yes. So SWAN and ADCIRC. So SWAN is simulating waves in the near shore or something like that. And then ADCIRC is Advanced Circulation Model. Engineers are not very creative with their names, but that's the names we came up with them. And so, without getting into too much detail, this is the coupled model, a SWAN ADCIRC model. It's state-of-the-art hydrodynamics and wave model. They're coupled, so we run one, and it's interlaced with the other one, so it runs the hydrodynamics and waves, and then that's how we get the hurricane surge and set up.
You mentioned WAFIS.
Yeah, thank you for capturing all these. These are terms we use every day, and I forget that not everybody uses these every day. WAFIS is the next round of modeling that's going to give our wave envelope. Here's another creative name. WAFIS is wave height analysis for flood insurance studies. So it's the same model that Gary Ward used 30 years ago when he did these studies. It's the same model that we're using because it's very detailed, and it allows us to capture each home, each stilt under a home, dune elevations and all that. And that's the second round of modeling that we'll do that will end up with the mapping. And that's what Krista's going to talk about in a little bit. Yes, sir. Yes. So the question was, and I was just about to get to this, is how did we validate our model? Did we look at historic events and run it through our model? That's the question, right? Yes, and that's a great segue into the next point. That's exactly what we did. So this is the model setup and the model that I'm talking about. So once we had that model set up, we had all our land use and the water depth and everything else in there. We wanted to look at the storm climatology. We wanted to look at all the hurricanes that have hit in this area, what historically they look like. We wanted to add in all the storms that have happened since the last study and just do a good analysis of what's there. So we reviewed the historic storms, and then we actually looked at, through all that data, we looked at 5 storms where we had good historic data, and then we wanted to match our model. We want to run those through our model and see how well did it do, right? So that way we can validate and say, hey, we set up this fantastic model and it's able to replicate what actually happened historically. So what we looked at is things like that bullet list there: central pressure, radius to maximum winds, forward speed, storm heading, and a shape parameter called Holland's B. Those are the parameters that we looked at for all the events in this area. And we only looked at them for events in this area. We wanted to make sure we had local climatology. We weren't interested in what hits in Georgia or anything else, just what's of interest down here. So what we did was, well, let me say real quick, did we look at Irma? Yes, we did, but kind of in a roundabout way. When Irma was churning through the Caribbean basin, FEMA asked us to look at, hey, do you have any model runs that were like Irma, at what it was predicted to be, and can we get any idea of what's about to happen? So we don't usually run this model as a predictive model because it takes days to run. They usually run SLOSH, the NOAA's model, because it's very fast to run, and they can get results very quickly as they're changing shape. But we did have model runs that look just like it, and you can see some of the, you see this instance, it came up over Cuba and then went straight up through Florida. Nobody would ever predict a path like Irma, right? And then it's going to do a right turn right up through the state. I mean, that's just not something that would normally happen. But when we modeled it, we had something that looked just like it coming up over Cuba and then up and over the state. So that was very similar. And we were able to share that with FEMA to show, hey, here's what if it happens along this course with this heading, with this wind speed and everything, this is what it would look like. So even though it wasn't explicitly included in our 392 storms, it was very like Irma. And so we ran, as I said, we ran 5 validation storms, which I'll get to in a minute, but after that, we ran 392 different storms to then calculate what's the 1% annual chance event. So this storm was one of those 392. So about model validation. We want to be able, once we set up the model and everybody thinks it looks great, we want to run just NOAA tides through it. We just want to see, hey, can we just simulate tides, right? So we have all our NOAA data and we just run a regular tide event and see how we're doing. And that usually checks out pretty easily. But then we do also 5 known storms where we have high water marks, we have NOAA data, we have, debris lines, whatever it is, that kind of data that we can run that. Meteorologists give us the wind field, we run it through our model and see how we did. So we looked at every decade worth of storms. This is the decade of the 70s. And, I show people this because, look, hardly any storms hit in the 70s, but you have David in there, right, which was a significant event for most of the state. So it doesn't take a lot of storms, it just takes a significant storm. This was the decade of 2000s. And you can see, obviously, you have every shape, path. When you put all of them on there, NOAA has a great graphic that shows you all of them, and it's amazing, how many storms impact this area. This is a little bit hard to read, but what we were looking for here is where do we have good good water elevation data that we could use in our model validation. Where do we have good wave data? NOAA puts buoys offshore and collects the wave data, and that's great to have during a hurricane event to see how well we can model it. Unfortunately, they don't have many down here. They keep telling us that it's very difficult to anchor them in the Gulf Stream, and so they lose them all the time. So there's not good data in this area, so we were having to use data further north. Oops. So these are the 5 storms that we selected: Betsy, David, Andrew, George, and Wilma. So we ran those through, we checked them with data. So here's what a model run looks like. The red colors are higher storm surge elevations, the blue colors are lower. And you can see Andrew, hit Biscayne Bay. On the left kind of shows the overall, and then on the right shows kind of a blow up of what we're looking at. So that's the example of one model run that's looking at the elevations at each one of their nodes and plotting out the results. So we do a ton of QA/QC, quality control, on these things, right? So we run them, we look at them, we do comparisons like this. You see the measure data and then the SWAN AdCirc model data. So we're looking at the tides before Andrew hits, and then this is an example of one station where we're looking at the results of the peak surge. So you can see at that station, we start tracking the tides, gets it in pretty tight, and then the event hits, and we match the peak very well. And that's what we're looking for. We really want to make sure that we can match that peak. Now, this is one location. We matched it for the entire stretch from Monroe County up to West Palm Beach, right? So we were looking at data all over the place. That's one example. Here's Wilma in Key West. Again, you see we matched the peak really well. So that gives us a lot of confidence in our model, right? I mean, no model's perfect. I had a professor once that said, all models are wrong. Some of them are useful, some of them are helpful, but they're all wrong, right? They're just theoretical models. But we've shown that with this model, we can actually replicate what's happening during a storm surge. So once we feel good about that, we actually write up a full report. We give it to FEMA. FEMA has independent people review it, make sure that they agree with it. And then once it's signed off and blessed, then we run lots of different storm events, what we call synthetic storms. And that's with those 5 parameters that I talked about. So we have some running slow with high wind speeds, some running fast with low wind speeds, all those different combinations. And then we're calculating the 1% annual chance event at each one of those nodes. Right? So in the end, what we do is we run 392 different storms, and we take all those results and we calculate at each one of those nodes what is the resulting 1% annual chance event at each one of those nodes. So that's what we finally got through, and that's the data that we want to show you. So yeah, the question was, what was the order on the events on how we actually did the validation? We set up our model, and we have all the physics in there, like the state-of-the-art physics for what coastal engineers understand are the processes. Once we set it up, we run the storms through and check it against what actually happened to see how well we did. So, and there are plenty of times where we have to tweak the model, we have to move mesh nodes around, or hey, we didn't get this canal right, or the model blows up and goes unstable. That's the most dramatic thing that happens in modeling world. I have a friend that's a CSI guy, and he's got all kinds of cool stories about bodies and stuff like that. And I tell him my model blew up today. It was pretty exciting. But so that's all we can do is go back and look at each one of those channels and make sure then that and if it doesn't, then we go in and model mesh. Change the model mesh and make sure that it gets to where we want it to be. Any other question? Okay, so once we've done that, we feel good about it. We run all the 392 different results, and then we calculate the 1% annual chance at each one of those nodes. So now that we've gotten this far, we can finally go back and look at and compare it to what you had in your previous study that was done 30 years ago, and that's what Krista's going to come chat with you about. Any other questions before I sit down? Okay, yes. Right, so the question is for those listening later, The question was, if somebody's done a private study that changes the maps, which is called a letter of map revision or a LOMA, will that be included in the new maps? And the answer is yes. What we do is we create our maps, and then we take every one of those letter of map revisions. We have to go through every one of them and validate it, whether it stays as it is or if it's superseded based on the new study. So we put eyeballs on every one of those and check.
And so when a coastal study comes in and redoes an entire area like this, we are producing new storm surge elevations, new still waters. That is the basis that a letter of map revision uses to come in and redo a map. So since we are superseding them with this new study, those letters of map revision will be superseded with this study. But what we do is we have all of them, and we look at the submissions that were provided for those. A lot of times they include really good detailed information about the properties, like maybe a surveyed little seawall or some additional information about the mangroves that they have out front. So we'll look at those areas that have their letters of map revision in order to, while we're coming back in and remapping them with the new storm surge information, to capture the detailed information that was provided for the LOMAR as well. So we're using information from the LOMAR that was submitted, but we will be superseding it because we will have new information about the storm surge.
Crystal, could you also address how LOMAs
That's what I was going to say. We will take a look at everything, all the letter of map amendments, revisions. We'll take a look at both those and incorporate and do whatever. But what will also come out when we send out the preliminary maps and the flood insurance study text will be a list of summary actions, SOMA, summary of map actions. Gee, I hate acronyms. But anyway, that will list the ones that we the ones that got superseded or the ones that are still valid. That will be in that list. So that's one thing that you will want to look at. And what I tell everybody is, especially the local officials, take a look at it. Especially on like the letter of map revisions, make sure we incorporated all of them. We looked at those, okay? But that list will come out. So, I know we had a meeting one time and we had a real estate person come in who managed, I don't know how many different condos. And she asked that same question. We were able to go to look at that list. Now this was a riverine, it had nothing to do with coastal, but we were able to look at that list to see, yes, it got incorporated, nope, it got superseded, it got thrown out, whatever. So that information will be there.
Is it safe to say that in the past, if somebody had a LOMA for their property, it was extinguished when the maps came out? But this time around, they're actually looking at them individually to see if they're just going to retain them or not.
Yeah, so the process of doing that summary of map amendments, creating, is that each of those LOMAs that were submitted will be looked at, and the same information that was used to, the same type of determination that was done at the time it was submitted, basically a comparison of the information about lowest adjacent grade and the surveyed information about the structure is compared to the new base flood elevations on the new map. So the end product of our study is a new map with new base flood elevations. When a LOMA determination is made, you compare the base flood elevation to lowest adjacent grade, usually. And so that same determination will be automatically done for all of the LOMAs using the new base flood elevations. Does that make sense?
And to clarify the difference between a LOMAR, which ends in R, and a LOMA that ends in A.
Okay, let me do that one since I used to teach a class on that, letter map changes. A letter of map amendment with the A. I do not use the acronyms because they sound the same in my ears. I don't know, I got hearing aids now, so maybe I can distinguish them, but no, just kidding. Letter of map amendment. That's basically what I say is the ground is high and dry. It should have never been shown in the floodplain on the map, or an A zone or a V zone. It should have never been shown in there. But because we used the quad sheets, as Mike was talking about years ago, we actually put people in the floodplain that probably shouldn't have been, but we didn't have good topo. So what happened is the surveyor would go out, shoot the lowest floor of the building, and the ground elevation, lowest adjacent grade. And what I talk about that, I always give the example of where this wall, say this is the outside of the building, where it hits the ground, right there. If that elevation is above the base flood elevation, according to the surveyor, we would issue a letter of map amendment that basically says this house is not in the special flood hazard area, and thus the flood insurance is waived. Now, what we suggest is you still get flood insurance, get a preferred risk policy. There is a letter of map revision based on fill. And what that is, again, is usually a single lot. That property is low. It's below the base flood elevation. Somebody comes in and wants to build on it, goes to get a building permit and talks to the floodplain administrator and says, I can't let you build there because that property is below the flood elevation. So you fill that property and bring that property up to above the flood elevation. And again, surveyor goes out, shoots the floor, and shoots that lowest adjacent grade, and that low adjacent grade is now, because of fill, above the flood elevation. We write the same type of letter. The letter of map amendment and the letter of map revision based on fill, we use a form called the MT-1 form, and normally those are filled out by the homeowner and a surveyor does that. Then there's the other one, a letter of map revision. That's one where an engineer is going to be involved in that one because they're going to do something with the flood study itself. They're going to revise it for one reason or another. Not necessarily in the coastal areas, but in, let's say, the riverine areas. They're putting a bridge in across a canal. You're putting a culvert in the canal. You don't like where the canal's at and you want to move it to another location. What happens in certain areas. I know of one area where they did a whole bunch of things with this one creek. But that's a letter of map revision where actually you went in, redid the study, and reran the study and maybe even changed the flood elevations based on some new data. You know, maybe we said the canal was this wide, and when it really is this wide. So our study was, had some problems with it, and some things have changed over the years. So a letter of map revision would be for that. Normally that is multi-lots. It's a commercial development. It may be a subdivision, things like that. So that one would take an engineer where they would redo the flood study itself. Now, going back to the letter of map amendment and a revision based on fill, do we change the map panels for those? No. We write a simple letter. Because, you can't really take that map and put a little white dot right there and remove the gray. The letter of map revisions, sometimes we would take maybe a portion of the panel and redelineate what the floodplain would look like on it based on the letter of map revision. And then there's one more in there when it's multiple panels. Another way this letter of map revision change multiple panels, we would do what we call a PMR, physical map revision, where we would actually reprint the panels. We are doing that in some of the other areas in the country. So hopefully that'll answer that question.
Yeah, my house is on Olivia Street near the cemetery, and the flood zone boundary line goes through the building. So the larger part was in the X zone, but because part of it was in an AE6 flood zone, the building is in an AE6 flood zone. But I got an elevation certificate, and the ground was higher than 6 feet. It was 6.3 feet. So I got a letter of map amendment, which means that house is now in the X zone, regardless of what the map says. Now, conversely, when we talk about revising the flood map, down by the southernmost point, if you've been around for a while, there used to be a 2-story kind of business housing complex in there. It was dilapidated and it was torn down. And now you have these 2-story houses being built there. That was a V zone originally because they calculated on the original maps that the tumultuous waves would come in there and cause damage. But it would have limited construction, so the developers went to the effort and the cost to hire engineers and say, the V zone shouldn't go this far inland. And the engineers found that that was true, and they presented it to FEMA. So now you see the flood zone boundary lines actually change around that area where those buildings were built.
How did we Xerox a portion of the map and redraw it and put that in a letter, or do you know?
Yeah, typical letter map revision comes with the old map, and it shows you where the old zones were, and then it shows you where the new ones are. And
that's how we would normally do a letter of map revision.
Yeah.
Not reprint the panel itself.
Yeah.
That's what
tell you, we're not that far along in the study yet to say that.
You just have to look at.
We'll have to wait when we get a little bit further along in the study to decide that. Where V-zone may be here today, it may be here tomorrow, when we finish the study, or it may be over here. We don't know that we're that far along yet to say that. I'll let her be the expert. That's something we'll have to know.
If we can have you use the microphone on the lectern, please.
What Krista was saying is, the reasoning for changing the V to an A is they're gonna look at that data to find out why.
Right, so usually when people submit letters of map revision, which is what you're talking about when the map actually gets redrawn and the lines on the map move. In coastal areas, when those letters of map revision the engineers come in, you hire an engineer to come in and do a little mini study for your property, your group of properties to look at that. The main thing that drives those changes on the map and allows the lines to move is the use of more modern, better resolution topographic information, better resolution ground information. Our modeling is inherently using this really great LiDAR, the laser shot ground elevation information. So we're using really great ground elevation information, similar to what's being used for those revisions. But there's going to be other things involved in our study too. Most importantly, the new storm surge analysis results. That may mean if those storm surge analysis results are similar to what's currently on the maps, then our results from the wave analysis may end up having lines very similar to what's on the maps now. If there's areas where the storm surge elevations are changing quite a bit, then there may also be changes to the lines as a result of that. But we're using this really great topographic information that was the basis of those revisions and is also the basis of our study.
What you are saying is once that study does come out, all previous changes to the map will be superseded by this map.
That is correct.
So anybody has any concerns about those new maps, they would have to go through that process again.
That is correct. Because the output of the study is fully redrawn maps for the entire city and county. And so all of those lines will be redrawn using the results from the state-of-the-art study. The ones where you just get a letter to say, is my house above that base flood elevation or not, that'll be the ones that are processed automatically. But the product of our study will be fully redrawn maps with new lines everywhere. Any other questions? Okay. So I'm up here to talk about the results of the study, of the storm surge part of the study. As Michael led off at the beginning, reminder that the storm surge is just... Sure.
They didn't get the recording of his question. I couldn't hear his question. You can restate your question real quick. If someone has a question, if you can repeat your question, then answer.
Thank you for the reminder.
I'll use the microphone and you can just speak.
Thank you.
My question was just restating what Krista said is once the new study is released, all previous changes to maps by whatever means are superseded. So once the new map lines come out, if you don't like the results, you'll have to go through that process again. That's my question.
Okay, so the phase of the study where we are now, as a reminder, we have completed the storm surge study. The results of the storm surge study are 1% are the still water levels. The still water levels include that storm surge, they include tide, and they also include wave setup, because wave setup was able to be produced this time by putting that wave model on top. And Michael was talking about the cool, sexy model that can couple storm surge and wave setup. So our output is a 1% still water elevation that includes both storm surge and wave setup into one number. So the question was, does that mean that it's going to be automatically higher? And the answer is, so the current study that is effective for the county and for the city right now, your effective study that's dated 2005, but for which the analysis was really done 30 years ago or so, That study did also calculate wave setup. It was calculated in a different way, though. So so both of the studies include wave setup. They were calculated in different ways, and the modern way was able to account for it in a much more robust way. But it's not a totally new component to the study analysis. As Michael also had mentioned earlier, just the high resolution, the model setup, it means that there's increases in some places and decreases in other places. And I'll show you that in a second. That's what one of the things we're here to show is the first look at the comparison of those still water elevations only, no wave effects on top of them, of how those compare to your current storm surge still water elevations. So that's what I'm going to walk you through right now. The main product that we brought here today to share with you as a way to kind of encapsulate and show what our first look at what those storm surge results look like and how they compare to what you currently have. We created some comparison maps. And what the comparison maps are going to show is, if you're familiar with the report, well, they show a comparison of still water elevations. So the still water elevations, as a reminder, are the first, let me just go way back to this thing. Should have stuck one of these slides in here. Here, this thing. So your BFE includes wave heights. Your BFE includes the tippy tops of a wave, or it includes wave run-up. Those are created in steps 3 and 4. What we have here today are the results from steps 1 and 2, still water elevation and wave setup. These values are not the same as the BFEs on the map, but they are contained in your FIS report. That's a report that accompanies the map. Many of you has anyone ever looked at the FIS report, the flood insurance study report? Okay. Well, very few hands went up. So, right, so this is kind of background data because it's not the end result, but it is the fundamental level. This is the water level upon which the waves ride. And so it's an important thing to know. And so it is tabulated in tables within this published report called your flood insurance rate report. I bet, do you have it posted on the site? Scott has it posted on the city's site. It's also posted on FEMA's website. I'll have some screen captures in here, some pictures of the table that I'm talking about in the report if you want to go look at it. But basically, we did the work to go dig through that report and pull out what your current elevations are in order to make it easier to compare how those elevations measure up to the new elevations to start giving you an idea of what we're seeing. So, wait, here we go. Back to where I was. The map will indicate the difference in those still water elevations. This is not a comparison of base flood elevations. This is a comparison just of those still water elevations. The 2018 data, that's the data, the draft results from our work. It does include wave setup. That's what I was talking about, that it'll include both of those steps, the storm surge plus the little piece of the wave setup on top of it. It does not include that overland wave height stuff. I'll talk about that process. That's the second phase of the study that my group's going to lead. But it's going to take us a while to add those extra wave heights on top to create your BFEs. So for now, we're only looking at storm surge. Here's a picture of what, if you were to look in that report I'm talking about, you would see a table like is shown at the top of this slide. The information is provided as it relates to transects. If you haven't looked in the FIS report, you might not be familiar with the concept of transects either. The way that the maps are produced, we run the next phase of the work, does another set of modeling where we take cross sections that run across the island and measure the waves as they run across the island along those cross sections. We call those cross sections transects. And so we have information. So the FIS report presents information in terms of the location of those transects. So the little map down on the right there is also out of that report that I'm talking about. And it's to show you that transects 1 and 2, as it turns out, run right over Key West. So as an example of what, and we have hard copies of these maps that I'm going to show you, small versions up here on the screen, but then we can pull the maps out and you can look at them more closely, out here on the stage if we want. But I just wanted to explain what those maps are going to show you. What we did was we pulled the information from the current Stillwater information, storm surge results, from that effective report. Those elevations are currently listed in terms of NGVD. That's the datum from which they were measured. Basically, all ground heights and water heights have to be measured from a 0. Back in the old days, that 0 was called NGVD. Since these maps were created, they moved the 0. And so now we're measuring it from a different place. And so in order for our results to be able to be compared to the results in your study, we had to convert them so that they were measured, so that we had an apples to apples comparison instead of an apples to pears comparison. So that's what it means, conversion from NGVD to NAVD. We just wanted to make sure that when we say 8 feet, they mean 8 feet too. Another we talked about was wave setup included in the effective study. It was, but it was only included for the storm surge that goes around the perimeter of all the islands in the Keys. It was not extended up over land. It was a limitation of the way that they were able to calculate wave setup back in the day, but it created an artificial drop in water. Because if you think about it, when the water gets pushed up against the islands, it doesn't reach the shoreline, which is now under 6 feet of water, and then start dipping down towards the middle. It keeps ramping up and against that high ground. It pushes up on a kind of a constant slope like this. That's why when we have those little graphics, the wave setup piece, it looks like this. It's getting pushed up against the high ground on a gradient. So it was weird that the old methods weren't able to do it, and it created this artificial depression in your current storm surge elevations. Any questions? And then this last piece, so the Stillwater elevation, it's very hard to tell from the tables in the report. And let me see. So if you can't read that, which I'm sure you can't, because it's super tiny on these screens, it says for Transect 1, for example, out on the very edge, the elevation was 8.4, and in the middle it was 6.8. And then for Transect 2, which starts on the Atlantic side but runs along the same cross-section, it was 7.6 right at the shoreline, and then drops down to 6 feet in the middle. It's a little hard to tell just from this little table where that 6 foot is in space. But if you look at the maps, you can see where there's an AE6. And so it made sense that that storm surge elevation listed in that table must have is the storm surge elevation that was used to create the map and put an AE6 on the current map. Yes, sir.
I can see, since I'm sitting up here close,
Yeah.
I can see that transect number 1 is coming in from the Gulf of Mexico side, and then transect number 2 is coming in from the Atlantic Ocean side. So it's stopping right at the shoreline, though, on each side when it comes in. From what you're saying, it's not including the wave action over land.
No, these transects are the transects that are used to bring the wave action over land. And so that's why they come from both directions, is because the transect 1 starts offshore of the Gulf and runs into the island and makes the wave go that way. And then transect 2 is used to bring the waves from offshore in the Atlantic and to have them run over the same line, but from the other direction. Thanks. And so here's a look at just one comparison to show how that calculation was done. But these points were created basically every third transect running up the entire county. Again, recapping, the 2018 storm surges already include wave setup for all locations because we have this really high resolution 2D model. It went up over shore. There's wave setup included at every node if the process of wave setup occurs for that node. And our 2018 results do show that more normal pattern in storm surge, that it stays either flat as it goes kind of across the shoreline into the middle of the island, or it ramps up a little bit from the shoreline into the middle of the island. What that does mean is that when we, and so then we have the, I made this table at the bottom here. How big is that? Can you guys see it? Can see it a little bit? So the first column is the current storm surge results converted to NAVD. So the same values that were in that kind of photocopied table I had before, but converted to the new zero in order for us to do this subtraction. Then the next column next to it is our new results, and the final column is the difference. And so for transect 1 at the top, the current storm surge, your current study has an elevation of 7. Our new results were 6.2. And so the results actually went down by about 0.8 feet. The new storm surge is lower than the current storm surge for that location. From transect 2, which starts over on the Atlantic side, again, right at the shoreline, things are pretty similar. They're within a foot. This time, it went from 6.2 feet right on the coast to 6.4 with the new study. So things went up by 0.2 feet. The big difference is in the middle of the island, and it's partially because of that difference in the way the wave setup is treated, and partially because of the ability of the storm surge model to also show the storm surge propagating over land better. The old storm surge was quite low. It was 6, converted to an AVD, that it became 4.6. The new storm surge for that particular area where that point is, it's the red point on the map, that's 8 feet. So there's a difference of 3.4 feet, an increase in the storm surge, the 1% annual chance storm surge of 3.4 feet there. There's a couple other dots shown on the map too. And you can see usually along the edge, or oftentimes along the edge, you'll have dots that are gray or white, and that means the differences are with plus or minus a foot of your current ones. Dots that are in the warm colors, yellows, oranges, and reds, that means the new elevations are going up from the current elevations. Remember, just for the storm surge, not the base flood elevations, but being compared to the storm surges. And then in areas where there's blue dots, those are places where the storm surge elevations are going down. Yes, sir.
So is this actual data right now that you're speaking of?
It is.
So in other words, where the red dot is on the map, which would be in our historic district, you're saying the wave action coming through, which is now an X zone, it's going to be 3.5 foot higher than we anticipated previously?
So this is just the storm surge, so it doesn't have the wave results on top of it yet. And that dot is not, it's near your current X zone. It's not in the X zone. I know that. But the storm surge is, yes, sir. It is 3.4 feet higher than on your current map.
Coming in from the Atlantic.
That one,
Transect,
right, that one.
Transect 2 coming in from the Atlantic, as it crosses over the circled area at overland, we're gonna be anticipating it about 3.5 feet higher than what previously we would expect.
Right. The current mapping there is an AE6.
Right.
And so I would ignore for a minute the transect direction, because that point was located based on, we saw that it listed 6 foot surge, and then we looked on the map to find a place that it said 6 feet of surge and dropped a point there, because we didn't know exactly where along the transect it was. Yeah. Ignoring wave heights and the transect concept, the storm surge was 6 and GVD.
So this is going to be major? This looks like a major change to me. And
I would say the storm surge pattern in Key West is very complicated in a 2-dimensional form. But yes, for that area, it's a 3.4 foot increase.
That's major.
Yes, sir.
So in the end, after all is said and done, and the new maps come out, and, we're using these maps in terms of BFE, for commensurate location or any kind of equipment, or whatever the case, government 3 foot, effective at most.
That, yes, at 3.5 or 3.4 foot is the increase in storm surge, and I will say that's the first look. If there are additional wave heights on top of it, the BFE could be incrementally higher than that as well.
I can't really read the numbers all that well, but it would appear to indicate that the storm surge is higher in the middle of the island than on the coast, if I can read the numbers. Is
That is,
correct?
yes, that is true. For the
And
most,
as it travels overland, it gets higher.
Well, that's that setup. That's the setup that she was talking about.
The new model with the wave action.
I appreciate the models with the wave action, but I guess the real question is actuality in real life, is that surge higher in the middle of the island than it is on the coast?
So,
Is this kind of like a mini tidal wave that's going to be coming through then? When you,
I'm not sure what you mean.
well, it's going to be something that's 3.5 foot higher than what we anticipate. You say it's wave action on top of still what would be anticipated as still water. Would it be kind of like a mini tidal wave kind of sweeping through 3.5 foot on?
So this is not yet the wave. The only portion of this that is tied to the waves is the wave setup. And wave setup's a really hard concept to describe because it's very difficult to see. You can't stand on the beach and really visualize it. But what it is when the waves break, they're breaking in a forward motion. And so when they break, there's a lot of energy and pressure kind of pushing the water out and up in front of it. That's in addition to the storm surge itself is getting pushed up against the land mass from wind. And so between both the wind blowing the water up against the high ground in the middle of the island, that causes the water to kind of, the water out in open water, it's not getting built up against anything. So it's actually lower. And then when it gets pushed up against, it has less, there's a lot of friction. It doesn't have anywhere to go. So it starts piling up against the high ground. So that's why the middle of the island does start to collect more water.
let me point out though, and Kristen made this point, at either end, what they did last time was they did an analytic solution, they did math paper, and they added that setup to the open water. That's why our results are very similar in open water, right, along the coastline. They simply did not include it on the interior areas, and that's the difference that you're seeing. I don't think it's, I mean, our calculation simply includes it on the interior, and they did not previously. That's the largest difference. It's all the same. They just didn't add it in last time. Why they didn't add it in, we don't know, but they didn't, and that's the difference.
Yeah, and so that, you know, the red points in the middle, there's white points on either side. That means along the perimeter of the island, it's not just out and over in the water. It's also, you know, the edges of the built part of the island as well. The changes in still water are much smaller. But I intentionally put a point in one of the highest places because we don't want you to be surprised months from now. This is the first look. It's a big difference in some areas.
And this is based upon wind speed or barometric pressure or what, something that's causing that push?
Yeah, all of the,
We modeled 362 hurricanes.
yeah, yep, all of those 392 storms that the AdSarc model did take small wimpy hurricanes and big massive hurricanes, the whole gamut. It basically looks at, for the Keys, what are the type of hurricanes that come through here? Not just the big ones, but the little ones too. And through all of those possible hurricanes, that's why we have to run 392 of them to try to get kind of the realm of experience of storm surge. Some storm surges are only a foot. Some storm surges can be much greater than that.
And according to what you're saying up there on the table, this is the 1% chance. So this is once in 100 years.
This is the 1% annual chance. So each year there's a 1% chance that it could happen.
Yeah, we used to always say the 100-year. I've been around a long time, it's always been the 100-year, but we tried to get away from that nomenclature because everybody thought, it happens this year, it's not gonna happen for another 100 years. And what we're saying is, no, it really has a 1% chance of happening in any given year. So technically, you could have two of them in the same year. I've seen that before.
Right, and so Wilma was here when, 2005? And the bigger effects were in Key West or more north?
All of the Keys.
All of the Keys.
All of the Keys.
And then Irma was here 12, 13, what was that, 12 years later? And Irma, in some areas, also had a 1% annual chance type storm surge. Not the whole area. The Keys are hundreds of miles. So, you know, it's each experience is very unique to where you are on the Keys, where the hurricane crosses. These maps are meant to encapsulate that 1% annual chance experience everywhere along the Keys. And that's why we look at all the different hurricanes all together. And I'm sorry, and so you had asked, is this wind speed, is this barometric pressure? Yes, the model, that's what the model does, is it takes in wind, it takes in pressure, it takes in how fast the hurricanes move forward, and kind of does a mixed grab bag. We create 392 storms and run them all through, but the model is taking all of that into account to drive the storm surge.
Can I test for understanding here on this
Please
chart?
do.
Transect 1 and Transect 2 are that blue oval from two different directions.
Yes.
Transect 1 is coming in from the Gulf of Mexico. Transect 2 is the same line but coming in from the Atlantic.
Yes.
Why are there two Atlantic Ocean lines, if you will, on Transect 2?
Those 2 points represent the one point right at the shoreline and 1 point farther inland along the transect.
So the first line, the one that starts 6.2 and goes to 6.45, is the shore,
Yes, sir.
and the other is the inland.
Correct.
Okay, and one more thing, could you recap why the inland is going up like that? You described it earlier with the water coming into the shore and then kind of going around. Could you just do that one more time?
Yes. So water builds up over land because conceptually, the land at the shoreline is lower and then gradually gets higher. For the Keys, for Key West, and where that red dot is in particular, there's kind of a hook in the land as well that creates kind of a high water, come here and pile up here. So that's why that point is one of the higher differences between our new results and the old results. So what happens so if we ignore that kind of complex shape for a second and just imagine the linear Keys, because the rest of the Keys are more like this. If you have high ground in the middle, lower ground at the edge, the waves start breaking as they get closer to shore. The storm surge off flat, if you were to look at it kind of in 2 dimensions, the storm surge offshore before it gets to the ground is pretty flat itself. It's what is it? The new one is around 6 feet. So from about the shoreline offshore, it's generally about 6 feet. As it starts encountering the land and the land starts gradually getting higher, the water itself also starts building up across that ramp. There's friction that as it tries to move through the buildings and trees, it gets caught up, and that causes it to ramp up. And there's just like the high ground in the middle. Imagine if you, in much more slow motion, but if you were in your bathtub and were pushing the water against the edge of it, when it meets the side and there's nowhere else to go, it has nowhere else to go. So it also has to tilt up against that high ground because it's reaching a barrier and it can't go over it. Yes, sir.
I understand exactly what you're saying, but I would think
did you test that part on your model as well? And it showed that it actually built up like that and didn't simply go around the hump.
So, yes, so we did it in 2D, and so we let the water go exactly where we go through all the canals and all the different pieces. Again, the only reason you're seeing this difference is because they simply didn't add it in before. They didn't add it. But that's why we did a 2D model. So when the water comes and pushes up against whatever barrier island you have, it goes around, and it does exactly that, it goes around. This is the results that we are seeing in our 2D model.
It's unlimited volume.
And that's exactly what we're modeling. That's why we do the entire
It's
Atlantic
unlimited.
Basin.
When you ran it against the results in LOMA, that's what you found. That in the middle of the island, it drastically went up.
So we're not talking about some crazy ramp up. The results that we're seeing now are crazily similar to the previous ones. They simply didn't add that in the previous study. That's why you're seeing the difference. So that's why on the open coast, we're within half a foot of what Gary Ward did on pencil and paper 30 years ago.
Gary Ward, just so you all know that Frederick in 1979 caused the addition of wave heights because we'd done things without all the factors. So we immediately, and it's no different than Michael got asked to provide something during Irma's inboundness. I think that's great that FEMA asked them to research their records. But what we're looking at here is an oversimplification of the transects. Krista has made it so simple that we don't see the intenseness of the analysis. Back in the 79, 80 era, we didn't add all of this. We didn't look at the upland wave and upland water inflow. So now they're coming in with something that's much better. If you look on either side of this particular transect, it's white at the water level. So it didn't really change the basic analysis. What happened is in the topography of the uplands, whether it be buildings or vegetation or roads, conveyance pathways, all of a sudden you have one spot that came up as high as 3.44, which is probably still going to be modified when she gets to the final analysis. So I'm not really uncomfortable with showing one dot, but to have everybody here know that dots can change or locations can change, they presented it.
Yes, the dots certainly don't present the whole picture. We tried to come up with the best way to give you some idea of what's happening, but since it's very difficult because the old study only presents information along those transect lines related to the storm surge, those are the only places that we can give you comparison points right now. Until we get to the next phase where we start adding the wave, where we actually run the wave analysis on top. Because the results from that will be equivalent to the base flood elevations. And then we'll be able to do a comparison for the whole map. These are not elevations over land, correct? These are from zero. Correct. So there might be some confusion with that. Oh,
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, so these are not-
We need to know what the elevation is of the land to make a good comparison. So they might.
right. So right. The question or comment was, these elevations that are being shown are not how high is the water above the land. This is how high is the water above a zero. So if the storm surge elevation that this is showing here for that red dot is 8 feet, if the ground elevation there is 6 feet, then the water depth would be 2 feet. There are places in the island, of course, that have ground elevations that are higher than 8 feet. And those would be above the storm surge elevation, essentially in your mapped X. That would be the new X zone.
For those for a refresher, what is the difference between 0 NAVD and 0 NGVD?
We use a uniform value for the whole county of
1.3.
1.3.
I was going to say, we use a uniform value for the whole county of 1.4 for the sake of this comparison.
Higher.
6 feet NGVD is, no, 6 feet NGVD is 4.6 feet NAVD. So if
So there's just two different elevation datums, and they're based on ellipsoid heights or geode heights, I forget. But it changes throughout the state. And in our area, it ranges from 1.3 to 1.4 roughly. 29 is a higher datum than 88. So, like she said, 6 on a 29 is 4.6, 88. So that'll be sort of confusing when everybody has an old elevation certificate to go with the new maps. Unless the insurance people are up on that.
Yeah. And
yeah, we will make that conversion when we do the that summary of map amendment comparison. But yeah,
it's really interesting, and you got to be careful comparing apples to oranges. It's really amazing. Right.
Okay.
Yeah. You know, could you imagine if we had changed the metric? Thank goodness we didn't. But one real quick on that NGVD and AVD. What I was told was at one point there was like 15 places through on the coastline that were zero. And everybody said they were zero, and they did, you know, ran in. And then some smart aleck surveyor or engineer, whoever, decided, well, I'm going to connect the dots from 0 to 0 to 0 to 0. Come to find out they're not all zeros. So they said, okay, we need to come back in and do just 1 0. And I heard they're in the process of changing that even again.
Yeah, in the next 4 years
Yeah.
or so.
But I think the area that I heard that was the worst was like the Rocky Mountains, anywhere from 15 to 20 feet difference.
Yeah, it's substantial, the higher elevation.
Well, this is the main results that we're delivering. So I'm very glad we were having this detailed conversation, and we can roll out but I know someone has this room at 3:30, I think. So we can roll out the maps if folks want to look at it in detail in a second. I did want to go ahead, I'll go very quickly through the remainder of the presentation, but what the intention of the remainder of the presentation is to continue to talk about what comes next and to explain what is the transect-based analysis that will be used to create those base flood elevations. We'll be back here again when we have results from that, and I'll go through that in much more detail, but this is kind of a look ahead, and hopefully it'll help you piece together, okay, this is storm surge, still water, and then the piece to get to the base flood elevations, that's what I'm about to show you. So we call it overland wave analysis, because that's the idea. We use the transects to figure out the results from the 2D, the SWAN and the ADCIRC. We get waves from that SWAN model, but those waves are all offshore out in the water. And so we need to know what happens when the waves start interacting with the built environment, when they start running into buildings and trees. So the next phase, overland wave analysis, this is what we'll use. The results of this will tell us whether the area is the V zone or the A zone, and it'll tell us about where the limit of moderate wave action, the LIMWA. I'll tell you about a little bit more about that in a minute. The results from the model we'll use to draw the work maps. Those maps we'll come back and present them to you at a meeting called Flood Risk Review. Those will be draft work maps before they're preliminary. They're not official in any way. We come back and show you, okay, here's the draft, here's the results from that next set of modeling. And we make maps so that you can actually visualize what those results look like. Because if we just show you dots, again, it's really hard to visualize what that means to your maps. So we'll bring you maps the next time. Then we'll talk about the maps for a while, collect any comments, questions, work with you through understanding those maps. Once that's done, then we create those preliminary firms. Those are the first draft regulatory maps to come here, and we'll come for another meeting then. Then due process happens, and then those flood risk products are the ones that I forget. Mark was talking about those at the beginning, where you get more information about how deep is your water, really, pieces of information that help you make mitigation projects more effective and understand what your flood hazard means to you and to a property. So the overland wave analysis, what is it really? The result of our models right now, these points that we're showing you, they're the red line on this map. That's the storm surge. It's simplified in this graphic. It's flat. We've been talking about for a long time now, it's not flat as it goes over land. It often tilts up a bit until it reaches the point where the ground, but eventually, in the Keys, not always, but where there is high ground in the middle of the Keys, there comes a point where where the ground elevations may go above the surge elevations. Some of the islands here are very low throughout. There's not a high point, and so the surge might cover the entire island. That's not true for Key West. There is high ground in the middle of Key West. But so the overland wave analysis creates that blue line. The blue line is how high is the top of the wave when it rides on top of the storm surge. And that's really important because if you have relatively big waves riding on top of the storm surge, if those waves smash into the side of your building, they're going to punch it in. Waves are really strong. And so that's why for areas where the waves are pretty big, like V zones, or even in the areas just past V zones, that's why you're required to build just up on pilings above the wave height so that the waves can go underneath, because you don't want them smashing into the side of your building if they're pretty big waves. So that's why the coastal BFE is the top of that wave, because you really need to know how high those guys get. So we've talked about this before, right? So I'm talking about numbers 3 and 4 here. Those are the pieces that we use the transects to get. So here's a little concept of what I mean by transects. Each of those A, B, C, D white lines, they start out in the water, they run up over land, they encounter things, they go across the beach, or they go across the bulkhead, they run across the houses, they run through the mangroves, they run through the trees. The old study, your current study, has 111 of those transects. We have a lot more computing power, we have much better data. We're going to do 296 of those. We're really increasing the resolution and density of where those transect lines are so that we can capture a lot greater variability. The Keys have there's clusters of buildings, and then there's stretches of mangroves, and then there's, a beach, and then there's the hotel that built a bulkhead and sticking out in the water. And so we want the transects to be pretty dense where there's that variability so that the differences of what's on the land can be captured in the modeling and then in the mapping. Those little black lines, which probably can't tell that there's black lines, those have been laid out already. We've been here earlier. We did field reconnaissance, looked around. We've used Google Earth, and we looked at the ground elevations and looked at all kinds of different stuff to figure out where we wanted to place each of those lines. So they've been each one it wasn't an automated process. They were individually handpicked and drawn for the precise location that we wanted them to be, to cross the coast in the right place, to cross through the building, the communities in the right place, that kind of thing. Primary frontal dune is a concept that FEMA maps. Anywhere that there's a dune, the dune must be mapped as a zone VE. Not particularly important for Key West and Monroe County in general. There are a few stretches of things that look like dunes and have sea oats on them, but they're not up against houses. It's not really a super important feature on the map for you guys, but just wanted to put it there because it's a part of the program. So these are all the things that we're going to be looking at. I'm going to talk quickly because I know we're running short on time. Happy to answer questions afterwards, but like I said, we'll be back later to talk about it. But these are all the things that along each transect, we're going to look at these things, evaluate them individually for all of those 292 cross sections. We look at if the shoreline is erodible. Are there beaches or dunes that may wash away during a big storm? We look at if there are shore protection structures like bulkhead, seawalls, piles of rubble that people have put there to protect their shorelines. The structures are not more important. They're both erosion and structures are both important features of your coastlines throughout the county and the city. We'll look at both of them, but a note on the structures. most of the structures in the city and the county are they are bulkheads and seawalls that were built for the purpose of erosion protection, not necessarily massive seawalls that were there to fight off storm surge from the 1% annual chance flood. The implication of this is that while they were designed and planned to prevent erosion, it takes a lot of engineering and a lot of cement and rebar to make structures that are going to survive a 1% annual chance storm, because there's really big waves associated with that. So it's reasonable to expect that there might be some damage to some of these structures along the coastline. They're probably not going to be washed totally away, but they may experience damage during a 1% event. So what we do is we just assume that they get damaged a little bit. It's called partial failure. What usually happens to these kind of structures is the ground behind the structure gets scoured out. It gets eroded from behind the structure, and then the structure gets pushed over a little bit. So that's basically what we do, is we push the structure over a little bit to represent that kind of condition of what might happen during a big storm. It usually ends up making, the ground elevation stays basically the same. It just pushes the shoreline in a few feet because that's to account for that area that gets scoured out from behind the wall. So we'll do that for the individual bulkheads along the shoreline, but not for any, the seawall along Roosevelt Boulevard. That's a massive structure that won't get treated like that. That'll just get left where it is. And then we use the transects to actually look at the waves. Once we've done erosion and the structures, then you use the transects to look at, on the left-hand side, we have wave run-up. That's what happens when the waves come on shore and kind of meet a really steep shoreline and wash up it. That doesn't happen very frequently in the Keys because the Keys are pretty low. But there's some of the islands are built up, like Sunset Key is really, really tall, right? That the shoreline there is like this. So when a wave runs into the side of it, the whole island's not going to be underwater. The middle of it's going to be sticking up above the water. So the water will rush up the side of it. That's called wave run-up. For the vast majority of all of the rest of the Keys, including Key West, what we look at is overland wave propagation. That's what we call it when the ground is submerged. The storm surge has come in, there's already water above the land, and then we want to know, well, what do the waves do as they come on shore and they start interacting with those trees and the buildings? And so that's what that WAFIS model does. We mentioned that earlier, wave height analysis for flood insurance studies. Along that transect, we're able to tell the transect, along each little stretch as it marches inland, okay, there's trees here, there's buildings here. This is how close together those buildings are. This is how big those trees are. This is how dense the mangroves are and how tall the mangroves are. And so then the WAFIS model knows what to do with that information. And so as it encounters things like trees and buildings, the waves get smaller. Those are obstructions to the waves. They can't, it breaks the waves, it blocks them from getting any farther inland. If the transect runs out over open land where the wind's still really blowing and there's nothing to prevent the waves from moving, something like a golf course or the airport, or if it goes back out over water, the wind's blowing, it'll blow over the water, the waves will start growing a little bit again. And the model is able to account for that too. The top of those waves, the wave's crest elevation, that's your base flood elevation that comes out of that WAFIS model. And so what does that look like for a map? Again, we're looking kind of at a profile view because your transects are taking cross sections of your land. So what WAFIS will tell us is how much smaller is the wave getting as it goes across the land. At the point where the waves get smaller than 3 feet, like the waves themselves, they might be on top of 8 feet of storm surge, but the waves themselves, when they get smaller than 3 feet, that's when you go from a V zone to an A zone. And as you keep going farther inland, now you're in zone AE. There's a new feature on the map called the limit of moderate wave action. I'll tell you on the next slide. But that line is located as the waves keep going inland. They're smaller than 3 feet now. They keep going. They get smaller than 1 foot, 1.5 feet. That's where we drop the limit of moderate wave action, usually somewhere within the zone AE. Then past the limwa, the waves are less than 1.5 feet. And then eventually when the water elevation reaches the ground elevation, it's now too shallow to have waves. There's no water at all, actually. And so you're up above the flood elevation. You're up above at least the 1% annual chance flood in Zone X at that point. Any questions on that conceptually? So the limit of moderate wave. Who's familiar with the limit of moderate wave action? Anyone? Okay. The limit of moderate wave action is a new feature on the map. This is an informational layer. What it is that after many years of research and going into communities after storms and surveying the damage, FEMA and what they have a big team of what they call building science. These are people that are like forensic experts on what happened to this building during a storm and why was it damaged in the way that it was damaged. They looked at the damages that were found in buildings that were in AE zones and in areas where they knew the waves hadn't been 3 feet big there. The waves were smaller than that, but yet there was still substantial damage to the buildings. They were still getting their walls bashed in. And so what became understood was that waves as small as 1.5 feet can cause this severe structural damage to buildings. And so this new line on the map, which will look like this sawtooth black line, that now shows you where that area is that still has waves that are bigger than 1.5 feet. It's within your zone AE, but it's called the LIMWA. With the reasons for this, and so the area between the LIMWA and the V zone, so that area that has waves that's 1.5 feet to 3 feet, that's called the coastal A zone. It's called that in the building code publications that specify design features for how to construct buildings in these areas. And with the new year, the Florida Building Code, so for folks that are in the business, this is in the nitty-gritty of the codes, but just for you folks' awareness, if the Florida Building Code now references ASCE 24, which requires that the same types of building standards that are used in V zones, like building up on pilings to above the flood elevation, breakaway walls in that area below where the pilings are, that those standards are also required in this coastal A zone, that area between the LIMWA and the V zone.
Yeah, when FEMA put it on the map, we basically saw, like Krista said, after several disasters, we saw it after Katrina down in Mississippi, where in those AE zones, we were still getting wave action and doing damage to foundations. To be honest, I actually saw it after Opal over in the Panhandle, where we had a V zone, and then an A zone, and then the road. Somebody in that A zone built the A zone standards. A zone standard said you could build slab on grade. Somebody did that. The wave action came in, washed out the ground underneath that slab, and the houses went like that. So what FEMA did is put it on the maps and basically said it is just a line that we're showing you where you still have wave action greater than 1.5 feet. It is suggested that you build the V-zone standards in that area. At the first of the year, what the Florida Building Code did was said it's mandatory in Florida. They came out and said, we agree with FEMA, it's a good idea, but we're going to make it mandatory. So, I remember when we first presented this, somebody said it was December the 31st, somebody said it was January the 1st, whatever. First of the year, the Florida Building Code basically said any of these areas in this A zone that you're between the LIMWA line and the V zone, in that AE zone, you have to build to V zone standards, which makes sense. That's exactly what we were seeing. Kristen, you want to say anything else about that?
I was deployed down here during Irma, and as part of the work in the JFO, we started knowing that this was happening with the building codes. We started kind of putting together an outreach plan to help the communities kind of get the word out And so that's something that at the region, we want to continue to help you with, rolling it out to the folks in your community so that it's not just a matter of when the maps come out, it's, oh, there's that line, what am I supposed to do now? So we are working on some kind of handouts, and there's videos and that sort of thing that we'll be sure to kind of bring down and send down to you all during the different meetings that we come down and in the interim as well, so that we can start reaching out to the community and making sure people are aware of what the Limois line is, what does it mean to them in their rebuilding efforts and so forth.
Has the Limois line been established for all of the islands in the Keys?
It will be a product of this study, and it will be produced for the entire county.
If, I was going to say, there is some effective maps in the northeast part of Florida. Volusia, I believe, has got, their maps are effective, and there's one other county up there, I believe it has effective. From Nassau all the way down to Martin, they all have preliminary maps with it on there. I can't really say a whole lot about panhandling over there, but they're out there.
Right. For the Keys, it won't be available until this study has draft maps available.
And for the communities that are in the CRS program, you get credit for that in the that program.
And then the final note on the Limois, the bottom bullet here is an important one. That area called the coastal A zone, it has these floodplain management building requirements that we're talking about, but for the purposes of the FEMA National Flood Insurance Program, it's in the Zone AE. It's on. It doesn't matter which side of the Limois line your building is on. If it's in Zone AE, the same insurance rates for buildings apply in either area. So it's not a new insurance zone. It's a new floodplain management zone for the state of Florida. We're going to zoom through these because those are really like forward-looking things. We'll be back to talk to you about those things well before they come into play. This is the last.
Yeah, I was going to say there's one mistake on this one where it says preliminary map release, planning, flood risk review meeting, resilience meeting. That meeting will be moved out towards the end.
That resilience meeting.
Right.
Yeah.
Originally, when FEMA decided to do these meetings, we were told to put it there, was trying to get people to quit thinking about in or out. I'm sorry, people are still going to want to know whether they're in or out of the, the splash flood. What is my zone? So we decided to move that out. One slide that she did skip, go back real quick. One more, right there.
This one?
One of the things that we are doing as part of this package, a resilience package, or, the meeting and all that, is giving you some database, basically database is what it is, a bunch of data in the database. One of them is changes since last firm, because that's the question everybody wants to know. What's changed? Compare the old maps to the new maps. What's changed? What's changed different on the firms? So what we decided on this particular database, we'll send that out with the preliminary maps. So you will know what changed, because when the communities get to preliminaries, we ask them to look at them. Well, they don't want to have to necessarily go through every single panel. They really want to know where the areas are changed. So this is one piece of data that's been very helpful. People have used this as outreach. They have gotten this database, put it on their GIS system with property lines, and they've maybe even sent cards to all those people that were in like a X zone are now going to be in an A zone or a V zone, and let them know, hey, the new firms are going to show you coming in. That way they'll know before they get that letter from their insurance agent. So that was one of the things that we did as part of that. So it's been a really good thing that we put out with this. People have been using it for a lot of different things. So anyway, I just wanted to say that was one of the things. Okay,
I'll leave that up there. That's the laundry list of potential uses for the changes since last Fern. But yes, that was the end of the presentation. Thank you all for bearing with the long technical side of it and for all the really great questions. If you still have questions, please come up and we'll keep talking about them.
Yeah, one of the questions I'd like to get an answer to are the flood work maps. I've never seen one. So when I look at what's going to be a flood work map, what am I going to see that in comparison to what I see now on a firm?
It's going to have basically all of the features. It'll have the zones, it'll have the boundaries. The main difference is that it's just not formatted into a FEMA firm with all the same color codings. It'll be, I think we've been producing paper work maps, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so it'll be a paper map that with all of your, it'll have, right, it'll look like
So-
it'll just have maybe different colors.
All right, so it'd be a rough draft of what will ultimately be the finished product.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah,
The
so it'll
one
be the
thing-
full shebang.
Yeah, and the one thing, it really doesn't apply maybe down here in the Keys, but it would further north, is we will not show the A zones from the canals, the creeks, the rivers will not be shown on there. So where the river, the creek, the canals come together at the V zone, there is, a little bit of work that has to be done, to work with that area. That's what's normally not shown on a work map, but that doesn't apply down here.
And the timeline for the work map is when?
Where did our schedule, oh.
I think it said April
It's about a year.
or July.
It's a year from now.
One point I wanted to make for the people in the room is if you have an elevation certificate now, they're still going to be good, even though the datum's going to be changed. This is not unusual. And there are calculations that we can make rather routinely, so you're not going to have to run back out and get new elevation certificates.
You didn't want to hear that.
I put the schedule back up on there for it. It lists the estimates for work maps and prelims at this point.
Now, just to let you know, the four counties, what was it, Brevard to Martin County, we were scheduled to hold those final CCO meetings and those meetings, and about that time, we had a storm. So they got delayed almost 6 months. So hopefully that won't happen this time around. So we had to cancel them all. They said, yeah, sure, you can come down here, but you may not get from point A to point B. So we had to cancel those. But this hopefully schedule will hold out.
Yes, hopefully this is a calm hurricane season for y'all down here.
So earlier you talked about some maps we could roll out, and maybe this would be a good time to move to that conference room over there so we can start freeing this up for
is there
the
a room?
city commission that's coming in. Yeah, it's right in that corner there where he's standing up. We have to go out the double doors and go in there.
Same time, so, yeah, we'll have paper for people to look at.
Okay, but they will be available. Okay. And then the thing, and for comments too. Are y'all handling all the comments?
So, yeah, that's right, I heard about it. I'm like, okay, so you're here and not there. Oh, okay. Yeah, I heard that you're, yeah. So what we're doing now with work maps is kind of new, right? So we want to get the work maps out there and get any comments that people have then before we get into the
Good.
Because it's way easier for us. We'd much rather, Gary gives me comments and I take it and I include it, and rather than I have to send him a formal letter, I got your comments, thank you very much, here's what I got, here's what I'm doing. I just take it and deal with it because it's way easier for us to do that.
All right.
We were posting our.
So we have